Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video.
Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today we're talking about the Pauper Win-A-Duel tournament that happened at Through the Decades on June 6th. This was actually part of a larger event, the Louisville Grand Prix, with the main event actually being a pre-modern 5K. Through the Decades did a great job at making this event more than just people playing Magic. There were food trucks on site, there was a playmat that you got if you entered the pre-modern event, or could just buy individually with the artist there, and we also had a very well-known Magic artist, Ed Beard Jr., who's best well known for Nicol Bola, Psychotog, Arcades Sabbath, and the Birds of Paradise art seen in the picture. Throughout the day, there were Mirage, Tempest, and Urza's block drafts, as well as, of course, what we're talking about today, the Pauper Win-A-Duel. The pre-modern event ended up with 137 players, which is absolutely outrageous for a small format like pre-modern. And because that event started at 9, and then the Pauper Win-A-Duel tournament was pushed back and started at 3 this time, if you were not doing so hot in the pre-modern event, there were quite a few people who ended up dropping from that, which made it so this was actually the biggest Pauper Win-A-Duel at Through the Decades so far, with 62 players. But anyway, enough about all this. We're talking about this small sliver down here, the Pauper Win-A-Duel. Entry was $30, and you could get a Tundra for first place and a Bayou for second place, with store credit going to 3rd through 8th. And because there were so many players there, they actually ended up increasing the store credit that everybody got. First and second place, when they would have only gotten the duels, ended up with $150 and $100 in store credit respectively. And 3rd through 8th all got a $50 bump from the usual payout. It's great having a store that, with the success of a big event like this, puts that money back into the hands of the players who do well there. So of course, whenever I go to a bigger tournament, I have an internal monologue and sometimes an external monologue about what deck I want to play. Of course, I have a few decks that I enjoy playing, but if I'm trying to be a little bit more serious about a big tournament, I probably want to figure out why I should be playing the deck that I'm going to bring. And the best thing to consider when bringing a deck is, what does the meta look like? What am I expecting to see at this tournament? So there were 4 decks that I was anticipating seeing quite a lot of based on how the meta is right now. That's Mono Red Madness, Grixis Affinity, Jund Wildfire, and Elves. These are decks that are pretty well established on MTGO, and also decks that we've seen previously in decent quantities at the Pauper Win-A-Duels at TTD. So I wanted to bring a deck that would give me the best chance against these 4 decks. Now, Mono Black Sack is one of the decks that I have brought previously. Actually, all 3 times I've been to the Win-A-Duels, I've brought Black Sack. It's a deck I know very well, I really enjoy, but how does it actually fare against these 4 decks that I'm trying to target? Well, I would say it's probably about even against Mono Red Madness. It depends, of course, on draws. It depends on how familiar both players are with the matchup. Of course, I know the matchup very well against Mono Red Madness, but how well I can do against them often depends on how well they know the Black Sack matchup. But overall, I would call that even. Unfortunately, against both Grixis Affinity and Jund Wildfire, I would say we are unfavored. Kirkland Shaman and Toxic Analysis is the main reason, which can just totally devastate our board. And depending on the exact build of the list, definitely the list that I run, I think that we are favored against Elves. I put the indicator all the way down here because it was kind of blending in up here. But I'd run enough hard removal in my main deck and then my sideboard. Plus the deck is fast enough that I usually only need about 1 removal spell to slow them down to the point where they have to start chump blocking our threats, and we can usually win the game from there. So overall, against the 4 decks I'm trying to target, we have 1 even, 2 negative, and 1 positive. Another deck that I play a ton of is Jund Wildfire. This is what I brought to the Pauper 1K at SEG Con last month, which I also have a tournament report on. Jund Wildfire is a great deck and can do pretty well against any meta, but looking at it at this one specifically, I think it has a bad matchup against Mono Red Madness. Depends a little bit on your list, but it's hard to fit enough life gain in the main deck so that your first game is pretty good, and it's not too hard for them to steal a second or third game, whichever one that they're on the play. I think Jund is definitely favored against Grixis Affinity. It just outgrinds them a little bit and has slightly bigger threats. Obviously, it's even against itself. Very much depends on draw, pilot skill, and things like that. And then I would say it's probably even against Elves, although to be honest, at SCG Con, I got pretty demolished by Elves twice, which kind of made me want to put this at a negative matchup, but I think that's just recency bias and things like that. I think this is probably a balanced matchup in general. And so that leaves Jund Wildfire with 2 equal matches, 1 positive, 1 negative. So then I decided to go to the 3rd main deck that I play a lot of and I think can generally compete in a meta, which is White Weenie. White Weenie, I think, has a pretty equal matchup to Mono Red Madness. I honestly don't mind it too much because we do have a lot of life gain and prismatic strands that I would almost maybe even say we're favored, but I don't think it's favored 5 to 10%. I think it's probably like 1 to 2%, because if you don't have the removal for the Gutter Snipe or the Kessig Flame Breather right away, they can often deal way more damage than you can prevent or gain. So I would call this an even matchup, although I wouldn't be too upset to see it. Then both Grixis Affinity and Jund Wildfire, I think, are favored. We're pretty aggressive, so especially Wildfire, but either of them that are spending turns just drawing cards, developing, we can start pressuring them early. Krark-Clan Shaman's not that big of a deal to us because we can Prismatic Strands to prevent a lot of that damage, and about half of our threats are just in the air, so Krark isn't even always killing everything that we have anyway. Plus, post sideboard, we of course have Dust to Dust, which absolutely shreds Affinity and also still gives us a pretty big leg up against Jund. So for all these reasons, I'm pretty happy with either of those matchups. The only matchup here that we have that's negative, I would say, is Elves. I definitely have a lot of experience with the Elves matchup because I think I get paired against it basically every time I play White Weenie online, but it's very reliant on them having a bad draw and you having your sideboard cards in games 2 and 3. So in general, I would say it's unfavored because if you just don't have the exact right card at the right time, they usually can run over you and you can't do much about it, which gives White Weenie 1 equal match, 1 negative, and 2 positive matches. Now, I can't say I thought all of this out quite as in-depth as I've laid it out here, but this was generally the idea of why I decided to go with White Weenie for this tournament, was that I was worried about how Black Sack and Jund would fare against these main 4 decks, and I was only worried about White Weenie against Elves. The other 3 I was pretty confident I could win. Now, let's take a look at the meta that actually showed up. Unlike at SEGCon where everything was done through Melee, unfortunately, this event was all done through Companion, and I didn't have any access to get matchup data, so unfortunately we don't have any way to know exactly how well every individual deck did against other decks and things like that. So we'll just hide this for now, but we do just have the raw number of each deck. Surprising no one, we had 9 Mono Red Madness players. This was the most played deck. Elves quickly behind with 8 players, and I will say every single time I sat down, whether I was against any of these or not, there were Elves and Madness players all around me, so I knew these were going to be the top 2 decks. Grixis Affinity was 3rd with 7 players, so I'm pretty happy that I nailed 3 of the 4 top decks. However, Jund Wildfire was all the way down here. Only a single player brought it. There was another Win-a-Duel that only one Jund player was at, so I guess this isn't unprecedented, but there's also been at least 1 or 2 events that there were 5 or 6 of those players, so I guess they just didn't come out this time. Just a quick note, because I thought it was interesting, if you drop Jund from your consideration of our top 4 decks and just go with the top 3, Black Sack loses a negative matchup, Jund loses an equal matchup, and White Weenie loses a positive matchup, meaning all 3 of these would have been 1 positive, 1 negative, and 1 equal in the top 3. So maybe it didn't matter after all what I actually picked because we misevaluated Jund a little bit. Anyway, those were the top 3 played decks. By far, a huge drop off from 7 Grixis Affinity players to 3 players on Cycle Storm, surprisingly, Dimir Terror and Golgari Gardens. 2 players each of Azorius Familiars, Gruul Monsters, Mono Black Sacrifice, Mono Blue Terror, and Monster Tron. And then a single player of meta and fringe decks alike, 4-color Snow Control, Boros Tribe, Dimir Flicker, Dimir Spirits, Esper Ephemerate, Esper Familiars, those are a little bit different, Golgari Food Gardens, or Food Pestilence, Gruul Panza, Jund Gardens, Jund Wildfire. 1 player had a Mono Blue Fairies list with a Terror sideboard. Their sideboard was 4 Tolarian Terror, 4 Cryptic Serpent, 4 Mental Note, and 3 Brainstorm, with a very standard looking Mono Blue Fairies list. Seems very interesting. Definitely would have loved to play against it. 1 Mono White Heroic, 1 Naya Gates, a Persistent Petitioner's Mill, a Rakdos Madness, Red Rally, some more pretty meta decks that we only had 1 of here, 1 Spy combo, 1 Teamer Pizza combo, and 1 White Weenie player. Who could that have been? So the meta was pretty diverse, but definitely had 3 decks that were outshining everybody else. A little bit less diverse than some tournaments we've had in the past. The 1K at SEGCon last month only had 5 players with a single deck, which was Mono Red Madness, and this one we had up to 9. Now, I do think that was in part due to the pre-modern event. I talked with a lot of players who said that they hadn't played Pauper before, and their friend who had just lent them a deck, and I think 3 or 4 of those people who said that ended up with Mono Red Madness, because of course that's a relatively easy deck to lend out. Most people understand the base level of a burn deck, if not all the intricacies of it. So I took White Weenie. Let's take a look at the deck list that I chose. It's not going to be super shocking. There's only a couple changes that I made from my stock list, which was that I was feeling like we needed a couple more win cons for the deck. So our 1-drops all look pretty standard. 4 Lunarch Veteran, 4 Novice Inspector, 4 Thraben Inspector, and 1 Steadfast Unicorn. 2s, we have Core Skyfisher, Rafine's Informant, and Thraben Charm, a full playset of each of those. Then I decided to go down 2 Militia Buglers here in order to increase a Leonardo to 3 and a Guardian's Pledge to 3. Like I've said previously, I have been enjoying the Bugler, and I don't know if these changes were ultimately the best thing ever. I just, late night before a tournament, you gotta switch a couple cards around. Sometimes you can't help yourself. And I felt like maybe a little bit more push would be good. We're also playing 3 Prismatic Strands, 4 Battle Screech, 18 Plains, and 2 Idyllic Range. Then my sideboard, this is the paper sideboard that I had. It's a little different from my online sideboard, but we do of course have 3 Dust to Dusts. I also play a 1 of Revoke Existence and a 1 Destroy Evil, which can help with more enchantments or bigger creatures, 2 Holy Light, 3 Journey to Nowhere, 3 Martyr of Sands, and 2 Standard Bearer. So like I said, very similar to the stock list that I play on MTGO, just a couple minor differences. I've been really enjoying this list, think it's pretty good, and think it's a little underrepresented in tournaments right now. So I was feeling pretty good about my deck choice. Even without Jund being a prevalent deck, still if I go up against Grixis Affinity or Mono Red Madness, I think I'll be very favored. I just wanted to dodge the Elves matchup. So round 1 we went up against Elves, but luckily it didn't start out too poorly for us. Our opponent played a Llanowar Elves on turn 1, but turn 2 was completely insignificant. I believe they just cast a Roost Seek for a basic, played it, and with 2 mana open didn't do anything. I should say that they mulliganed to 6 and were very clearly unhappy with keeping the 6 that they had, but didn't feel like they could go down to 5. But this gave us time to develop our game plan, of course. We got a Thraben Inspector and a Rafine's Informant down, and then a Skyfisher. Just some various bodies getting some value, getting ready to attack. On turn 3, our opponent played a Forest, so 3 lands and a Llanowar Elves, and did not cast a single spell. And that's when I knew that I was in a very good spot already. This means that their hand had to be pretty much all lands or expensive creatures like Generous Ent, Avenging Hunter. Generous Ent can be a little bit troubling for us sometimes, but if it's not getting ramped out, it's not that big of a deal, and Avenging Hunter is actually much more of a liability for our opponent than for us, as we have a lot of flyers, and if we take the initiative once, Prismatic Strands can often protect it and keep us alive to just win the game from the initiative they introduced. We did start beating it for some damage, but they did eventually slowly start building up their forces. They played some more Mana Dork Elves. We saw that part of the reason that their hand was so slow is they had a couple Masked Vandals with just no targets for them. We did have some clues, but I was actually leaving up mana pretty early because after our initial creatures, I didn't have that many things to cast, so I was actually cracking clues on their turn. They did manage to get a Generous Ent out, which then stalled the board entirely. We each continued to play creatures on our own turn, 1 or 2 of them. I was cracking some clues. We were definitely at a halt, but I do think I was pulling ahead just because I was able to get a little bit more card advantage with my creatures, and they weren't seeing really any Lead the Stampedes or Winding Ways. Eventually, they managed to find a Quirion Ranger and then a Timberwatch Elf, which did survive a turn cycle, so it was able to pump, but they didn't have enough creatures to really go in for an attack. Well, they had enough creatures. They probably had 7 or 8, but we had 11 at this point, so any attack that they made could have been met by a much larger attack against them. Then I top decked the Thraben Charm that I needed. This Timberwatch Elf, now I remember clearly, they had 8 creatures on the board because I had to do the math. Can this Thraben Charm kill a Timberwatch Elf if they can double pump it with this Quirion Ranger? Since they had 8 creatures, they could pump it to be plus 16 or an 18 toughness creature. Luckily for me, I had 11 creatures on the board, so I very casually Thraben Charmed this Timberwatch Elf for 22 damage. He did make the very smart play of pumping 2 Elves before it died, just so that my attacks couldn't really get in that turn, which I did not end up attacking. But he had very little going for him and eventually had to cast the Avenging Hunter that I could tell had been rotting in his hand this entire time, as there'd just been 1 card he hadn't been playing. This already was going to push me to attack with everything, but I had also just built up enough creatures that I thought I could actually push through for some serious damage. And then I drew a Leonardo. I had about 2 or 3 more attackers than they did. So Leonardo was going to come down and be an 11 power creature, then Guardian's Pledge was either going to instantly kill them, or at the very least, if they blocked almost all of our creatures, I would eat 7 or 8 Elves and definitely win the game from there. So I attacked, he made a couple blocks, I Leonardo'd, Guardian's Pledge, and we went to game 2, taking down the first one. Game 2, they led on a Quirion Ranger, and then turn 2, they just had to bounce their land to play a Priest of Titania. We started with a Steadfast Unicorn, Thraben Charmed down the Priest of Titania, then played a Rafine's Informant, pitching some spell, so it was a 3-2. They ended up playing a Timberwatch Elf, still had that Quirion Ranger, passed to me, and I had my turn with my Unicorn and my Rafine's Informant. Decided just to go for an attack and see how they would block, if at all. It would have been safest for them not to block, but they were under quite a bit of pressure already, so it makes some sense why they wanted to block our Steadfast Unicorn with the Timberwatch Elf. Unfortunately for them, this pulled them straight into our trap, as I had a Holy Light and 3 mana to cast it. killing the Quarian Ranger, shrinking the Timberwatch Elf to die to the Steadfast Unicorn. And frankly, that put them too far behind that I think the game was over pretty quickly afterwards. I think they had amassed a Vandal or something like that just to block for a little bit, but their ramp elf plan just kind of fell apart, and I was able to take a quick win against them, which was nice starting off on a win against Elves, the deck that I was most concerned playing against. Round 2, we played against Persistent Petitioner Mill. This is the same player that I've played against at the SCG Con 1K, as well as one of the previous Pauper Win-a-Duels, so I already knew what they were going to be playing. White Weenie has an okay matchup here, I think. Thraben Charms do a lot of work exiling the graveyard since they're reliant on that, but we don't have that much removal, so if we can't apply the proper pressure and they're able to just get out enough advisors to start milling us, it's totally possible they could kill us before we were able to kill them. They started with a Glistener Seer and some other advisor early, starting to scry every single turn in their upkeep to try to make sure they were hitting their land drops and finding Persistent Petitioners. We started with an Inspector, then an early Rafine's Informant pitching a Battle Screech. The following turn, we flashed back the Battle Screech, so I had a 5-creature board on turn 3. They were hitting land drops and were casting creatures, but unfortunately for them, it was just a little too slow. It was 1 creature a turn. So I believe it took till turn 4 of theirs to play their Persistent Petitioners and have enough creatures to use it. I believe we were on the play, which meant that that would be our turn 5, when we already had 5 creatures, including birds. We attacked with the team. I'm not sure they blocked at all. They did mill themselves with their 4 creatures, but unfortunately they didn't have the mana to actually cast a Moment's Peace or a Gnaw to the Bone. And I just had the Guardian's Pledge to pump the team and steal a quick game 1. Game 2, they started with not just 1, but 2 Glistener Seers, now scrying twice every single turn. They did make some banter about trying to find land drops, while also, of course, trying to find petitioners. I do believe game 1, I also bluff attacked with the Novice Inspector once or twice, and in game 2, they did not respect any pump spells or anything like that, and actually started blocking them, which saved them a couple points of life early in the game. We were able to amass quite a big army pretty quickly. A Veteran, Skyfisher, a Bugler, and a full Battle Screech by turn 4. Veteran was pumping our life total up in the matchup where it doesn't really matter. I believe we went up to 30, 35 life. We attacked them for 6 or so at one point. They went down to 14. The next turn, we attacked for 10. They had mana up for a Moment's Peace. I did have a Guardian's Pledge, but obviously I didn't want to cast that into a fog spell, so I just let them take 10, and they cast nothing. This did give them an additional turn, but I figured wasting the Guardian's Pledge this turn and then only dealing 10 damage next turn was worse than just keeping it for a later turn. The following turn we attacked, still had the Guardian's Pledge, but didn't need it to present lethal damage, and they did in fact cast the Moment's Peace from hand, keeping them alive, as they were able to develop out their 4th advisor, the Persistent Petitioners, and start milling themselves. Now, I did have a Journey to Nowhere immediately following the Petitioner to exile that. They, in response, milled themselves 12. And I was holding a Thraben Charm in my hand for pretty much this entire game, which I knew would come in handy at some point. I was going to hold on to it for as long as possible to exile their graveyard in response to a Gnaw to the Bone, which would gain them a bunch of life. Although if I really needed and thought it was the best decision, I could use it to kill a Petitioner in a pinch. They end up milling a Moment's Peace, and the next 4 or 5 turns look basically the same. They end up casting 2.5 Moment's Pieces, that being 2 Moment's Peace from hand and then from the graveyard, and also 1 from the graveyard. So 5 turns in a row we got fogged. Throughout it, they had some draws where they kind of just whiffed, didn't draw anything relevant, except for maybe a fog, and then they did have another Persistent Petitioners at a time, which I was able to Journey to Nowhere. They milled themselves for 12. I believe that might have actually been what found the additional Moment's Peace. Finally, they land a 3rd Petitioners. I go for a big attack. I already know 3 Moment's Peace are in exile, and they've been counting their graveyard, which you would do in general playing this deck, but it was pretty obvious to me they probably had a Gnaw to the Bone in hand, and they started talking about needing to mill a Moment's Peace, so I knew obviously that couldn't be in hand. So they thought for a little while and decided to mill themselves for another 12, and then had the choice to Gnaw to the Bone from hand, or they did in fact mill the last Moment's Peace, so they could cast that instead. The problem is they only had 3 mana and could only do 1 of them, and I think they correctly cast the Moment's Peace, keeping the Gnaw to the Bone for a future turn. While I do think it was the correct choice, unfortunately they'd already milled themselves 3 times, and with some additional land searches and card draw, they only had about 8 cards left in their deck. They had tapped out for the Moment's Peace, so even though I wasn't doing this in response to a Gnaw to the Bone, I used the Thraben Charm to exile their entire graveyard, which meant that the Gnaw to the Bone in their hand didn't gain them any life, they couldn't mill themselves anymore, and I was definitely going to kill them seeing as they had missed all their fogs. So unfortunately for them, they got charmed. So we are 2-0 going into round 3, and we're against Jund Gardens, which I can tell pretty quickly because they play a Colony Gardens, then a Twisted Landscape, then they cycle an Ash Barrens for a snow-covered mountain while sacrificing the landscape for a snow-covered swamp. So they play Lembas and Ichor Wellspring, a bunch of card draw artifacts, And the big thing that I need to keep in mind for this entire match is that they're going to have Breath Weapon. Instant Speed Board Wipe is pretty good against the deck with all creatures. And we should watch out for some cast downs as well. I start with just a Thraben Inspector, then a Skyfisher, then Veteran, some more creatures. We're trying to play it a little bit slow, applying enough pressure that they feel like they're going to be forced to use a Breath Weapon, but not so much that we're going to get totally blown out if they do have it. But turn 5, I get a Rafine's Informant, which I play, discarding a Battle Screech, and then flash it back with the Veteran, Informant, and Inspector, and attack with the Skyfisher. Now, the Skyfisher gets cast down, but I do get 2 birds, leaving us with 5 creatures on board, and I'm comfortable doing this because I have a Guardian's Pledge in hand and 3 mana available. So if they have the Breath Weapon, I can actually just save my whole team in response. Now, if they have another Breath Weapon, that's going to be a little tricky, but they only had 1 red mana at the time, so it felt like it was probably a good time to go for this. They played some more card draw spells on their turn and left up that 3 mana for Breath Weapon, but I draw a 6th land, I play that for turn, attack with the team, and cast Guardian's Pledge, which will be dealing more than 15 damage. A Breath Weapon and say, do you have a second one? And I do in fact have a second Guardian's Pledge, so I'm able to take game 1, dealing roughly 30 damage. Game 2 is a little harder because they start with a campfire right away, and then of course just some artifacts and draw spells to develop their cards. We start very similarly to the first game, playing some creatures out, but unfortunately our creatures meet some untimely demises a lot quicker this time, getting Skred and cast down, making it so we lose all of our best creatures and don't really have a lot of ways to deal them damage. My hand was already looking a little thin here, which meant I kind of just had no choice but to go all in on a Battle Screech. So I cast that, make 2 birds, flash it back, make 2 more birds, just hoping that they don't have the Breath Weapon. And of course, unfortunately, they did. Now, I was able to rebuild a little bit here, and we even had, I think, 40 life from some Lunarch veterans. I'm sure I missed some specific creatures that we cast throughout there. I apologize, I can't remember everything. But I do know they cast a Writhing Chrysalis, which is fine because we had the Thraben Charm to kill it, dealing it 8 or 10 damage. And then they found another Writhing Chrysalis, and I think a couple turns later, after that stalled us out, we found another Thraben Charm for it, which was great. Unfortunately, they found another Writhing Chrysalis, and then we had the Thraben Charm for it, which was great. Unfortunately, all 4 Writhing Chrysalis, and we only found 3 of our charms. I had brought in some Journey to Nowheres also to kill the Chrysalis, but alas, it was not enough. Eventually couldn't get through the Chrysalis. I think they played a Sagu Wildling, which hit us like 7 times or something before we eventually died. Game 3 started pretty similarly for them, with the Campfire turn 1. I forgot to mention in these games, he was campfiring over and over and over, gaining tons of life, which made it very difficult to get across the finish line. Started with a Campfire, then a Wellspring, then a Spell Bomb, drew some more cards throughout. And after game 2, I actually decided that the Campfires were so much of a problem. That was the real reason that I think we lost that game, was because he gained way too much life. So I sighted in Dust to Dust and used it really early on a Spell Bomb to make sure that our Battle Screeches couldn't be interrupted, because we had a Lunarch veteran on the field, which would allow them to interrupt it, and also so that they wouldn't gain a bunch of life with Campfire. He was extremely shocked by the Dust to Dust, so at the very least, we won the mental battle, if not winning the actual game. Unfortunately, we were once again put into a position where we had to just go all in on a Battle Screech and hope they didn't have it. I would have loved to do exactly what we did game 1, which is have a Rafine's Informant to reduce the cost of our Battle Screech from 4 to 2, even if it only makes 2 birds, and then allows us to hold up 3 mana for our Guardian's Pledge, or even Prismatic Strands to keep our creatures alive through a Breath Weapon. Fortunately, we didn't see a Guardian's Pledge or Prismatic Strands, so there was no protection either way, so I just had to go for it with 4 birds from a Battle Screech, and unfortunately, you know what happened. This actually happened relatively quickly in the game, probably turn 5 or 6. They were very quickly able to play a couple Chrysalis that were instantly 6/7s and beat us down in about 2 turns. And we got our first loss of the event, but no worries. We're halfway through the tournament and we're still due to run into Grixis Affinity or a Mono Red Madness player at any time. So we get paired against Elves again, this time against my buddy that we drove all the way here with, who I specifically told on the drive and also in our playtest a couple days before that I didn't want to get paired against Elves. He had a pretty good start game 1 with Quirion Ranger, an early Timberwatch Elf, and a Priest of Titania. I had some various creatures on board, Inspectors and Informants, and had a Thraben Charm and the ability to kill just one of his 3 creatures, which is a tough choice. Priest makes a ton of mana, Timberwatch makes combat very scary for both attacking and blocking, and Quirion Ranger doubles either of these. In almost every scenario, I would usually kill the Timberwatch Elf because I'd rather they have to play more creatures that could then be scary rather than just have the scary on board right then. But he had 4-ish cards in hand that I didn't know what they were. I was worried with a Priest and a Quirion Ranger, which was tapping for probably 10 mana between the 2 activations, that there would be Generous Ents, Avenging Hunters, maybe lead the Stampede into a million more creatures. So usually I would kill the Timberwatch Elf here, and instead I killed the Priest of Titania. He then followed that up immediately playing another Quirion Ranger and another Timberwatch Elf, as well as like a Findhorn Elves or something, which initially made me think, oh, I'm glad I killed the Priest because at least they don't have mana and pump. But then quickly, you probably know how this works. 4 activations of a Timberwatch Elf basically makes any creature lethal, and that means any single creature getting through is lethal, which means you have to block all of them, and then they actually don't have to pump them all on the single creature. They pump them on all the individual creatures, and then you have to basically be chump blocking with 4 creatures every single turn. And that's exactly what I did and lost in about 2 turns. Based on what he ended up having in hand, I think it would have been right to not kill the Priest and to kill the Timberwatch Elf instead. However, with another Quirion and a Timberwatch Elf, I'm not sure it would have made that much of a difference. Game 2, he started a little bit slower with just an Elvish Mystic on turn 1, and then no second land drop and a Crashing Drawbridge on turn 2. Of course, I was on the play, so I played a Thraben Inspector, Rafine's Informant, and then decided that I had this Journey to Nowhere, and it was probably worth getting rid of his Elvish Mystic, seeing as he only had 1 land on the board. Now, I could have gotten rid of the Drawbridge, because of course Drawbridge can give haste to any other elves he plays, but I thought him having only 1 mana, even if that 1 mana let him play like another elf that could then get haste and play another elf, was probably better than him being able to play a Priest of Titania, even if he then had to wait an extra turn for it. So I journeyed the Elvish Mystic, which slowed him down considerably. I think he played a Llanowar Elves and then maybe a Priest after that, but there was not a lot of follow-up. On turn 4, we went for a full Battle Screech, putting tons of birds on the board while he was still trying to develop his mana. He had an okay turn, tapping a Priest of Titania, playing a 3-drop. Maybe it was a Timberwatch Elf. It doesn't really matter because we, of course, had the pledge and were able to finish off game 2 pretty easily. Then game 3, we had something like this for our opening hand. And this is what I would call a perfectly serviceable opening hand, but generally against Elves, you don't want to just keep a perfectly serviceable hand. You generally need to have a sideboard card of Holy Light or Standard Bearer. Journey to Nowhere is a sideboard card that I bring in for this match. It's decent, but it's not generally going to win you the game on its own. So I begrudgingly mulliganed this reasonable hand and drew, I'm pretty sure 5, if not 6 of the exact same cards, and decided to keep it, despite the fact that I just mulliganed the same hand, because it wasn't going to stop my opponent. I probably should have mulliganed this hand as well, because it still didn't do what I needed it to. I think I put the Battle Screech on the bottom, Journey to slow them down just a little bit. Unfortunately, they had just about the best start you could have. Quirion Ranger, Priest of Titania, Timberwatch Elf stuff. I did Journey the Priest, I believe, but it was not enough to slow them down. Again, without our sideboard cards, he was able to just go way too fast, and eventually we lost to a bunch of Timberwatch Elves, just as we did in game 1. Round 5, we went up against Gruul Panza. This was actually a player who had previously said hi to me, said he loved the videos, which I always appreciate. I always like meeting people when I go to these events. I was on the play here, and we got down an Inspector, followed by an Informant, which pitched a Battle Screech. He did have just about the best start you can have, though, with an Arbor Elf turn 1. I didn't have a way to kill it. Wild Growth into a Thermokarst. Thermokarst could have been a better card, and I will say it didn't actually slow us down that much. He blew up one of our 2 lands. We then top-decked another land, which I didn't otherwise have, and so was still able to play a 2-drop, and then the next turn I top-decked another land, able to play a 3-drop. So the 1 land destruction spell that he played here didn't matter too much. However, the Wild Growth Arbor Elf start that I was not able to interrupt spiraled out of control quickly. He then had a Utopia Sprawl on the same land, which meant that that land was tapping for 3, with Arbor Elf that was tapping for 6, cast a Boarding Party that cascaded into a Bonder's Ornament, and later cast a Colossal Dread Mask. Bonder's Ornament basically drew him a new card every single turn for the next several turns, which was surprisingly powerful, as I was a little behind, didn't have too much to do with my mana, and his giant creatures were keeping the pressure up on me while the Bonder's Ornament restocked his hand. At one point, he then attacked with a Boarding Party, the Colossal Dread Mask, Germ, and 2 Eldrazi Repurposers, to which I looked at the Prismatic Strands in my hand and just laughed, because in his primarily green deck, he was attacking me with a red creature, a colorless creature, and a black creature, because that's what color the Germ is, which meant the Prismatic Strands did very little. I did end up using a Strands to, I think, prevent damage from the Germ a couple of times. Again, naming black, it's very important that you do that, because if you name green, the Germ is not green. The Germ is the one dealing the damage. We had a Guardian's Pledge, but unfortunately had to use it defensively to block and not lose all of our creatures to a couple blocks. And eventually he slammed an Avenging Hunter, which often is something I enjoy in this matchup, because again, just like against Elves, if we take the initiative and can keep it with the strands, we are in a good spot. But we already mentioned strands is not very good, and we just didn't have the creatures to actually take the initiative. So we lost that game, unfortunately. I've never done or even thought about this before, but seeing as the artifacts that really killed us here was the Colossal Dread Mask, I didn't end up killing the Germ because it would have not been that relevant to. They could have just re-equipped it. And the Bondage Ornament kept their hand absolutely stocked. So for the first time playing against Grill Pawns, I actually thought I wanted some artifact destruction. So I brought in 1 Revoke Existence and 1 Dust to Dust. And in retrospect, the Dust to Dust was probably a little overambitious. I had seen 2 artifacts killing us and assumed that they were probably playing 2 to 4 Bondage Ornaments, although I assumed the Colossal Dread Mask was probably a 1 of. I think this was probably overkill, but I do actually think the Revoke Existence could have been decent, because also exiling an enchantment, getting rid of a Wild Growth or a Utopia Sprawl would not have been irrelevant. So game 2, he starts with an Arbor Elf, and I immediately journey it to nowhere, knowing that I need to slow down his mana. But unfortunately, our plan just doesn't develop. We don't really have very efficient, cheap creatures, which is kind of our entire deck. And eventually just end up stuck with cards in hand. We did draw the 1 of Dust to Dust. He didn't have a single artifact on the battlefield, so Revoke Existence wouldn't have done much either. I also drew 2 of my copies of Leonardo with no good attackers, meaning I couldn't even deploy 1 of them for cheap. And so despite interrupting his mana early with the Journey to Nowhere, eventually he got to cast a Chrysalis, a couple more Repurposers, and Avenging Hunter. And I think this just might have been the worst game that my deck personally played, just having no creatures to really cast. And yeah, we lost this one too, unfortunately, which put us to 2-3. 4-2 if we won this one, and the next one already would have been pretty tough to get into top 8 with, but 2-3 definitely made it so that we were not going to be making top 8 at this tournament. But no worries, there's 1 match left, and with 9 Mono Red Madness players and 7 Grixis Affinity players, surely we would be paired against one of them. We played against Elves for a 3rd time. I mean, this last match didn't really matter as far as stakes go. We were not getting into top 8 regardless, so it was pretty much just a fun match. And the guy I was playing with was very nice. We talked a little bit before he left, because I said that I had already played against Elves twice, and apologized that he was also playing Elves, which is, it's fine. I'm going to be honest, it was pretty late at this point, pretty tired, and when the match stopped being super relevant, I stopped keeping track quite as well. I don't honestly remember exactly what happened in game 1 and 2 of this Elves match. I believe I took an early victory in game 1, probably with some Guardian's Pledges or something like that. And then he quickly stomped me with, I think, Quirion Timberwatch Priest combo in game 2. Either way, we went to game 3, which was a little more interesting. He got Quirion, some Elves out, Priest of Titania, and then led the Stampede, showing 2 more Priests of Titania and an Avenging Hunter. Meanwhile, we didn't have a 1-drop, but we did have a Rafine's Informant, which ditched a Prismatic Strands. They ended up casting their Avenging Hunter, tapping all of their creatures to do so at some point. I had a 3-2 Rafine's Informant, which I attacked them with. They had up an Avenging Hunter 5-4, so they could have blocked, but clearly smelled that something was coming, and so decided to just take the damage. That gave me the initiative, but I still wanted to cast the trick that I had, which was Holy Light. This wiped away 2 Priests of Titania, Quirion Ranger, and I think a Findhorn Elves, but it did leave them with an Avenging Hunter. They were able to attack back, take the initiative, and put a couple counters on their 3rd Priest of Titania, which they had then cast. But we still had a Rafine's Informant, which was a 3-2, and could probably attack past the Priest of Titania unless he actually wanted to make that trade, which he made pretty clear he was not going to do. So I had some different cards I had in hand. I then deliberated on what to do exactly on this turn, but I cast a Battle Screech from hand for 4, not flashing it back because I wanted to attack with the Rafine's Informant, which I did. They didn't block with the Priest of Titania, which meant I got in and was able to go to the Forge since I'd already gotten the Secret Entrance, put 2 +1/+1 counters on my bird, which gave me a 3-3 bird and a 1-1 bird. I don't remember him casting anything super relevant, but on his turn eventually made the decision to attack the Avenging Hunter into the 4-4 power worth of birds, but he did forget that I had a Prismatic Strands in the graveyard. As soon as I blocked and cast it on green to kill his Avenging Hunter and retain the initiative, he facepalmed a little bit. It's a mistake that we've all made a million times, so no need to feel that bad about it. But killing his big creature, I think he just had a Priest and a couple lands on the battlefield, I was able to take the game pretty quickly, attacking with birds, Rafine's Informant, and trapping him. So eventually took the game and finished 3-3 in the tournament. But enough of what I did, because it was not all that exciting in the end. After 6 rounds of Swiss, we got to the quarterfinals, where we had 3 Mono Red Madness players, including one of the players that came in the car with me. And other than that, a pretty diverse top 8, with Elves, Grill Monsters, Golgari Gardens, Grixis Affinity, and Jund Gardens. so I got to relax a little bit while they duked it out. But eventually, the winners of the quarterfinal matches were the Jund Gardens player and all 3 of the Mono Red Madness players, bringing our top 4 to 75% Mono Red Madness and a 100% chance of at least one Mono Red Madness player making it to the finals. After a very painstaking 3-game match, unfortunately, my buddy lost to the Jund Gardens player. This is also the Jund Gardens player that I lost to earlier in the day. And Nicholas lost to Derek, giving us our finals for this TTD Pauper Win-a-Duel, which was Austin Graham on Jund Gardens versus Derek Davis on Mono Red Madness. We got to start heading back home with an ETA of about 1 in the morning, but we of course heard about the results later, and that was that Austin Graham won with Jund Gardens, going, I believe that's 801 for the day. Jumping back over to here, yep, 501 in the Swiss, and then 3 rounds in the top 8. So congrats to Austin on the Tundra and Derek on the Bayou. It was a pretty sweet tournament overall. I do wish that I hadn't gotten paired against 3 Elves players and no Mono Red Madness and no Grixis Affinity when those were the decks I was trying to target. Sometimes you just get a bit unlucky in the matchup lottery. I do think I probably could have done quite a bit better if I had brought Mono Black Sacrifice as a deck that does pretty well against Elves. But if I did bring that and then went up against a bunch of Grixis Affinity, I might have actually had a lot of trouble. So I don't necessarily think I made the wrong choice given the meta that I expected and given the meta that was actually there. But based on who I ended up playing, I certainly could have picked a different deck and would have if I knew those matchups would have been what I got. In any case, it was still a great time and I'm looking forward to the next one. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks to my $10 supporters, Howard Granger, JDNPX, Halcaz, Cody Cowell, DJ Vinyl, In Buns We Bust, Brotaku PC, Mr. Soleo, Paladillan C, and Blackjack Davey. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all next time.